Welcome to Mansplaining, a podcast about the interesting things and unexpected discoveries you can make if you just take the time to learn. I'm Mark, your host this week, and as always, I'm joined by Joe, an old friend from college. And together, we'll explore what's on our minds and hopefully figure out a thing or two about a thing or two. How's it going, Joe?
All right, I'm well, enjoying the snowfall. We got a nor'easter here in the northeast New York area, and it's we got at least 10 inches of snow, so my dog and I are greatly enjoying it right now.
Yes, one of the pure, unfiltered joys of the world is a dog in snow, where they just are so excited about a brand new landscape where nothing smells like the day before. Yeah, I love that. It's one of the things I really enjoy about winter.
Yes.
Okay, so let's get right into it because this is the Christmas season and I asked you about Christmas. And my question coming into this episode was, why is Christmas such a big deal? Because if you think about it in terms of part of the religious calendar, at least at some point in our history, Easter was probably a much bigger deal than Christmas. And yet we don't have Easter carols and we don't have a ton of Easter movies that we gather around to watch every year. So my question to you, Joe, is how did Christmas get so big?
Yeah, and I want to thank you for this question because the research was fascinating, and I have a lot to say about it, and I hope you're going to be interested in it. And you didn't even mention the war on Christmas, in which liberal Satanists like you and me want to banish all mention of the phrase Merry Christmas and replace it with Happy Holidays.
Yes, but I need to remind you, Joe, that it is a secret war on Christmas, so let's please not be obvious about our liberal agenda to remove Christmas from the equation.
Okay, will do. I'll actually have something to say about that at the end. But the short answer, I love my short answers, and the short answer to how Christmas became such a big deal is that Christmas was essentially rebranded from a religious festival steeped in ancient traditions to a secular holiday that's an integral part of the cultural and economic fabric of our nation and many other Western nations particularly. This rebranding happened as the result of a few pivotal reconsiderations of the meaning of the holiday that I'm going to detail for you. New elements were cobbled together from here and there, as you put it in your question, and that's an important part of the story. But at the same time, Christmas retains a profound connection to the religious life of the nearly 1/3 of the planet that identifies as Christian. In other words, there's something in it for practically everyone in a way that wasn't true as recently as a couple hundred years ago. So that's the short answer. And you're definitely right, Mark, that despite its popularity as a holiday, Christmas is only the second most important day in the Christian religious calendar. Easter, which commemorates the resurrection of Christ, is the most important day in the Christian liturgical year. So how did it happen that the second most important Christian holiday became the most popular? After all, it's not like our winner-take-all society to elevate second place over first place. My mind has a natural affinity for questionable analogies, so please bear with me as I give you one from the world of sports. Most everyone knows that Cassius Clay, who would later become Muhammad Ali, won the gold medal for the USA in the light heavyweight division in the 1960 Olympics in Rome. But nobody remembers who Clay beat to win the gold, right?
Right.
Wrong, actually. I remember the guy who won the silver medal because I'm a huge Ali fan. His name was Zbigniew Peter Zakowski of Poland, and he was a worthy opponent, an established boxer much older than the 18-year-old Clay, a former 3-time European champion and bronze medalist in the prior Olympics. Stay with me here, Mark. I'm going to argue that Christmas is the Cassius Clay of Christian holidays. It's the brash, cocky, but popular up-and-comer, the kid who wins over the crowd, compared to the staid, solid, but plodding old veteran Easter. How do you like that?
I'm ready for it. Bring it on.
All right. So let's talk about Easter for a sec. Granted, it has a better name than Zbigniew Peter Zakowski, but it's similarly snake-bit, despite being the most important Christian holiday. The Catechism tells us that Easter is the feast of feasts, the solemnity of solemnities. Everything in the church calendar points toward the primacy of Easter. There are 12 days of Christmas, but there's a 40-day build-up to Easter called Lent. Easter was celebrated by Christians long before Christmas. Early Christians knew that Sunday was a special day because it commemorated the Lord's resurrection, which was much more meaningful to them than the birth of Christ. Christians worshipped on Sundays instead of Saturdays because of Easter. Each and every Sunday is a mini Easter in which the Lord's rebirth is remembered. But notwithstanding the Easter Bunny, Easter Parade, and a few other pop culture artifacts, Easter remains rooted first and foremost in religious observance. And consider this, it's about death, which is not most people's favorite topic. It's also about an airy-fairy notion of ascension and resurrection that's hard for the average Joe or Mark to understand or relate to. So as a cultural touchstone, Easter never had a chance against Christmas, which is the story of birth. Who can't relate to a cuddly baby, not to mention cute animals and lots of gifts?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I'm trying to imagine taking the song Have a Holly Jolly Christmas and applying it to a commemoration of the death of Christ.
Yes, exactly. Christmas was originally known as the Feast of the Nativity of our Lord and Savior Jesus Christ, a.k.a. the birthday of Jesus of Nazareth. And just to clarify, I mean the city of Nazareth in what is now northern Israel, not the hard rock band Nazareth that sang the song Love Hurts. Although I'm sure Jesus, who was nailed to a friggin' cross for loving his peeps, would have appreciated those lyrics.
Yes, Jesus was metal before metal. I think we can agree.
And he had the haircut, too.
Mm-hmm.
Christmas is celebrated by religious and secular Christians alike, and millions of non-Christians as well. Today, more than 2 billion people in over 160 countries consider Christmas to be the most important holiday of the year. Even in countries like Thailand, where over 90% of the population is Buddhist, and Christmas is not a national holiday, people still exchange gifts on December 25th. The Pew Research Center published a report in 2013 on religion and public life, in which 92% of Americans said they celebrated Christmas, but only 51% said it was for them mostly a religious holiday. Nearly a third said it was more of a cultural holiday, and that number is growing. Young adults under 30 were much less likely than older ones to see Christmas as a religious holiday or to incorporate religious elements into their celebrations. And get this, 8 in 10 non-Christian Americans celebrate Christmas. I didn't realize how popular it was. For them, it's entirely a cultural holiday.
Right.
So we all know the basic story. Baby Jesus is born to Mary and Joseph. Mary was a virgin. Joseph wasn't actually the biological father because of the Immaculate Conception. I'll leave the professional genealogist to figure that out. Maybe Henry Louis Gates wants to take a crack at it. But I want to focus instead on the date of birth. Christmas Day marks the proximate date of Christ's birth, which we celebrate on December 25th. That date coincides with older nativity and seasonal celebrations, and they're worth reviewing because they show the extent to which Christmas is a derivative holiday. For centuries before Jesus, early Europeans celebrated the winter solstice on December 21st, which marks the darkest day of the year in the northern hemisphere and signals the return of light and warmth, and with it the birth of new life. In Europe in particular, late December was an ideal time to celebrate. Most cattle were slaughtered around that time so that they wouldn't have to be fed during the lean winter months. So there was an abundance of fresh meat for maybe the only time in the entire year. Plus, the wine and beer made that year had fermented and was finally ready for drinking.
So lots of meat, lots of booze, time to celebrate.
Yeah, exactly. In Scandinavia, the Norse celebrated what they called Yule, beginning on the solstice and lasting through January. To honor the return of the sun, Norse men and boys would carry home to their villages giant logs that they would set on fire, and the villagers would feast until the logs burned out, which would take about 12 days, a probable antecedent of the 12 days of Christmas.
And the tradition of the Yule log, too.
Yeah, right. The Norse imagined each spark from the glowing fire represented the birth of a new calf or pig in the new year. And that is where we get the thrilling tradition of staring blankly at the TV as the Yule log burns for hours on end.
Yes, yes.
Our younger listeners may not remember the Yule log. I don't think it's on TV anymore.
When I was a kid, we did have a fireplace in our home. I haven't had a fireplace in a long time. But every year around this time, I do remind myself that I can go to Netflix and pull up a very long video of a fire that's crackling, and I'm tempted because there is something that's just very seasonal about that.
Yes, and soothing. But as you pointed out, you've got all the elements for a good party here. You got a big, thick steak, a little vino, a few of them Norse chicks in fur coats, under the mistletoe, I'm sure, cozy fireplace. Bada bing, bada boom.
Yeah.
There you got a party.
Yeah, the party makes itself.
So the Germans celebrated their midwinter holiday by honoring the pagan god Odin. Many stayed inside at that time of year because they believed Odin flew through the sky at night to observe his people and then decide based on his surveillance who would prosper and who would die. I don't know, that sounds suspiciously like that fat guy with the beard who sees you when you're sleeping, knows when you're awake, and knows if you've been bad or good. Just saying.
Though generally speaking, he doesn't kill you if you're on the naughty list.
Well, it's a softened version.
Yeah.
In ancient Rome, where winters were not as harsh as in northern Europe, people celebrated Saturnalia, honoring Saturn, the god of agriculture. Beginning on December 17th and lasting a full month, Saturnalia was a festival of food, drink, and hedonistic excess. Many upper-class Romans also celebrated the birth of Mithra, the infant god of the rising sun, whose birthday was, take a guess,
December 25th.
December 25th. Reminders of another infant.
Right.
And by the way, I had never heard of Mithra before doing this research, and I immediately thought of Mothra, the equally believable giant flying caterpillar that fought Godzilla in a bunch of Japanese movies.
Yeah, well, I have heard of Mithra because, as I'm sure I've mentioned to you before, I spent time studying ancient religion. I spent many years doing this.
Yes.
And so I know all about the initiation ceremony that involved sacrificing a bull and collecting his blood in a big bowl, which you would then pour over the head of the initiate, which curiously has not entered into Christmas celebrations. We generally don't douse each other in blood, but,
Yes.
maybe we should.
Although I think you see my point, though, that a lot of these, what later became Christmas traditions, were borrowed from pre-religious festivals.
Right, 100%. And in fact, the technical term for that is syncretism, which is that's the term when a tradition is pieced together from things that came before and things that are adjacent, and then renamed and rebranded and presented as this new thing.
Yes. I didn't know the word syncretism, but it's certainly appropriate here. For early Christians, the birth of Jesus wasn't celebrated at all. Nowhere in the Bible is Jesus' birth date even mentioned. It wasn't until the 4th century, AD 336, that Roman bishops decided to make the birth of Jesus a holiday. There's some evidence that Jesus may have been born in the spring. Just think, why would all those shepherds have been herding their flocks in late December?
Yeah, it does pose questions.
But in any case, we can blame Pope Julius I for choosing December 25th. Many scholars believe he chose that date specifically to absorb the pagan traditions like the Roman Saturnalia festival and the birth of Mithra that I mentioned a minute ago. It also just happens to correspond to the date of the winter solstice on the Roman calendar.
Right. Yeah. And if you think of it through the lens of a sort of upstart religion that's trying to establish itself and wipe out what had come before, it's a lot easier than telling people, okay, take this celebration, which was awesome because you had lots of meat and alcohol and you had a great party going. Just stop doing that forever. Instead, you can say, keep on with the party, but let's just call it something different.
Right. Although, as I get further into this tale, you'll see that some of the party elements were removed later.
That is often the case.
Yeah. So Christmas, or the Feast of the Nativity as it was known at that time, gradually spread from Rome to Egypt in the 5th century, to England by the end of the 6th century, and as far as Scandinavia by the end of the 8th century. Celebrating Christmas at the same time as the traditional winter solstice festivals was a double-edged sword for church leaders. On the one hand, it greatly increased the chance that the new holiday would become popular, but on the other hand, it also weakened their ability to control how it was celebrated. For example, by the Middle Ages, pagan traditions had been supplanted by Christianity, and devout Christians attended church on Christmas. Sounds good so far. But right after church service, there was a raucous, alcohol-fueled carnival, a lot like Mardi Gras today. Every year, a beggar would be crowned the quote-unquote Lord of Misrule, with all the celebrants playing his subjects. Large groups of poor people would bang on the doors of rich people and demand their finest food and drink. If the rich people declined, the visitors might terrorize them with acts of mischief. Probably not what Pope Julius had in mind.
Reminded me of trick or treat in this scenario.
Yeah, good point. I didn't even think of that. But definitely not something that the church would have been thrilled about, I think it's safe to say. So when Oliver Cromwell and the Puritans took power in England in 1645, they actually canceled Christmas as part of their vow to rid the country of decadence.
Yeah, you can always count on the Puritans to be killjoys.
Yes. Cancel culture was alive and well in the 17th century. The Puritans considered Christmas a Catholic invention with no foundation in the Bible, and they associated it with drunkenness and other bad behavior. When the Brits grew tired of the Puritans and restored King Charles II to the throne in 1660, Christmas was officially uncancelled in England, but it remained disreputable in the minds of many people. Now, we know that the Puritan spirit was alive and well in early America in the form of the Pilgrims who colonized Plymouth, Massachusetts in the 17th century. Christmas was not a holiday in early America. In fact, the Pilgrims in Plymouth spent their first Christmas day working, which was their way of expressing their utter contempt for the holiday. Christmas was explicitly outlawed in Boston between 1659 and 1681, with fines of 5 shillings issued to anyone who so much as exhibited a trace of Christmas spirit. After the American Revolution, many English customs fell out of favor for obvious reasons, including Christmas. So, thus far, I've been telling you the story of a holiday that, like Christianity itself, was gradually spreading around the world and gaining adherents, but was still not the cultural juggernaut it is today. And that's because it really wasn't until the 19th century that Americans started to embrace Christmas. This is a really interesting story. With equal parts Yankee ingenuity and cultural conservatism, Americans basically re-engineered Christmas from the raucous carnival it had been in Europe into a sober and sedate family holiday focused on peace, nostalgia, and copious amounts of commercialism.
The American way, in other words.
Yeah, exactly, right. So I want to take a minute to talk about the conditions that catalyzed this change. There was a lot of class conflict in early 19th century America. Unemployment was sky high. There were riots. The riots were commonplace, usually started by gangs of jobless, disaffected people, and many of those riots took place around Christmas time. Our last podcast was about defunding the police, but here's something I didn't know about my hometown. New York City didn't fund its own police force until 1828 in response to a Christmas riot. The general mayhem inspired political leaders and their backers in the upper classes to change the way Christmas was celebrated in America. They were helped by the popularity of 3 books written around this time. One was A Christmas Carol by Charles Dickens, which was a ginormous bestseller published in 1843, whose message about charity and goodwill toward all of humanity resonated with many people in the USA and England, and it pointed to a different, more morally grounded way of celebrating the holiday. The second is a book almost nobody has heard of, The Sketchbook of Geoffrey Crayon, Gent, published nearly a quarter century before Dickens' book in 1819 by Washington Irving, who's much more famous for stories like Rip Van Winkle and The Legend of Sleepy Hollow. Set in an English manor house, it's a book of sketches about a country squire who invites peasants into his house for the Christmas holiday. Unlike the riots flaring between the haves and have-nots on the streets of America every December, in this telling, rich and poor mingled fruitfully to honor and live up to what was described as, quote, ancient customs. Irving's message was that Christmas should be a peaceful holiday in which people from all walks of life come together regardless of wealth or social status. But here's the thing, it wasn't based on any existing ancient customs that the writer experienced in his own life, or his readers for that matter. Rather, many historians think Irving invented what we now think of as Christmas tradition by simply stating that these were the age-old customs of the season. Isn't that fascinating? I knew nothing about this book before doing this research.
Yeah, that is kind of amazing. It does remind me a little bit of the current Trump strategy of if you just proclaim something as truth loudly enough, sometimes people take it as truth. So this would be a more benign example of that we can just redefine these as Christmas traditions because one person said it and other people decided to believe it.
Right, and the person who said it was a well-known author with a bestseller, so it had to be true, right? So the third book, I just want you to guess what the third book is, because you're going to kick yourself if you don't get it right.
Third book that defined our sense of Christmas. Well, I know it's not a book. There was a poem about, Jolly St. Nick that was published in a newspaper, but in terms of a book, I'll go straight to the kicking. I can't think. What is it?
Okay, well, you may have hit it. The third book started as a poem written in 1822 by an Episcopal minister named Clement Clark Moore, who called it An Account of a Visit from St. Nicholas, but which is more popularly known by its first verse, "'Twas the night before Christmas." Is that what you were thinking of?
That was what I was thinking of, though I thought it was much later than the date you gave, so I would have been wrong even when I was right.
Right. So this poem starred a character that we haven't talked about yet, Santa Claus. How and why Santa became so wildly popular says a lot about the United States as a melting pot, not only of people, but of ideas. Let me explain that. As Americans slowly embraced Christmas as a family holiday, people looked for ways old and new to celebrate the day, and ideas were cribbed both from established churches and from recent immigrants, many of whom hailed from Germany in those days. For example, Christmas trees became popular after Prince Albert of Germany married England's Queen Victoria and introduced the tradition to England. A British newspaper carried an illustration of the royal Christmas tree. It was picked up by an American magazine, and the custom spread rapidly in both countries after that. Over the next century, Americans refined their own version of tradition by incorporating other people's customs, like decorating the tree, cooking certain foods, sending holiday cards, caroling, which was developed from religious hymns that first appeared in 4th century Rome, and giving gifts, which originated with the gifts of gold, frankincense, and myrrh given to baby Jesus by the Magi. Mark, do you know what frankincense and myrrh are?
Are they perfumes?
They're aromatic forms of incense derived from the gum resin of trees native to the Arabian Peninsula. So the reason I ask this question is because gold I get, but I'm not sure why the Magi thought baby Jesus or his parents would want frankincense and myrrh.
Well, I suppose we have to take into account just how bad things smelled back in those days. We are talking about before there was indoor plumbing or sewers. And so the ability to have on hand something that you could burn that would make things smell better because it masks underlying smells, probably something that would seem quite nice to have.
Yeah. Point well taken, but I would still argue maybe gold, silver, and frankincense, and not 2 perfumes. And I just wonder if there was a gift return desk at the Walmart in Bethlehem in those days.
that the wise men brought gift receipts with this, and Mary's
frankincense again.
Mary's at the desk saying, "I lost the receipt for this, but I tell you, the wise men brought us myrrh. We've already got the frankincense. Can we just trade this for some silver?"
Lady, everybody says they're Jesus' mother. I hear the same story every day.
No silver, store credit only.
Anyway, before that digression, my point was that Americans mixed and matched holiday traditions to arrive at their own. Most American families believed they were celebrating Christmas the way it had been done for centuries, when in fact they had actually reinvented the holiday to fill their growing nation's cultural needs. In that way, the American idea of Christmas tradition embodies our country's national motto of E pluribus unum, from many one. And it was from that cultural ferment that Santa emerged. The story of Santa Claus can be traced back to a real St. Nicholas, who was a monk born in Turkey in 280 A.D. He became known as a protector of children and sailors because he gave away all his inherited wealth and spent his life traveling the countryside, helping the poor and sick. It wasn't until the late 18th century that he entered American popular culture via, interestingly, Dutch families in New York who commemorated the anniversary of the death of Sint Nicolaas, which was Dutch for St. Nicholas, which was later shortened to Sinterklaas. So Santa Claus drew his English name from that Dutch nickname. Clement Clarke Moore's poem was one of the first pop culture depictions of Santa Claus, the right jolly old elf flying from home to home via sled driven by reindeer, delivering toys to children worldwide. The picture of old St. Nick, dressed in red with the white beard and sack of toys over his shoulder, didn't arrive until nearly 60 years after Clarke's poem in 1881, when the political cartoonist Thomas Nast, of all people, borrowed from Clarke's poem to create the legendary image we know today. By that time, Christmas had already been declared a federal holiday via legislation signed by President Ulysses S. Grant in 1870. Moore's poem helped to popularize the tradition of exchanging gifts, whereupon Christmas shopping became a thing. Victorian-era families were becoming less regimented and more attuned to the emotional lives of their children, and Christmas provided them with one day every year when they could lavish gifts and attention on their kids without spoiling them. Merchants soon discovered that gift-giving was good business, leading to increased economic activity throughout the second half of the 19th century and into the 20th century, when Christmas season became an economic colossus and the peak selling season for retailers. In the U.S. today, approximately a quarter of all personal spending takes place during the extended Christmas shopping season, which begins long before Thanksgiving and doesn't end until all those ugly ties are returned or exchanged in early January. In 2019, the average American adult was projected to spend $920 on gifts alone. And it's no wonder, because according to Pew, 83% of Americans said that buying and receiving Christmas gifts made them feel joyful.
Yeah.
All this is to say, it's pretty clear nowadays that if Jesus were completely removed from the equation, Americans would continue to celebrate Christmas because so many Christmas rituals are divorced from religion. The noted culture critic Lucy Van Pelt may have put it best in my favorite holiday staple, A Charlie Brown Christmas, when she says to Charlie Brown, "Look, let's face it, we all know that Christmas is a big commercial racket. It's run by a big Eastern syndicate, you know."
Yeah.
The Christmas culture industry doesn't need Jesus, but the American economy most definitely needs Christmas.
Yeah. There's a pretty famous, I think it was a precursor to South Park, the animated show, where there's an episode where Santa Claus and Jesus come to have a fist fight over who properly owns Christmas. It's pretty funny if you haven't seen it.
I bet. No, I have not seen it. All right, I want to sum up now. So Christmas is preeminent, I say, because it's got a little bit of everything. From its placement in the calendar, it marks the return of light, warmth, and new life, celebrated by our pagan ancestors. From its roots in pagan celebrations, it gives us an opportunity to revel in earthly delights, like our European forebears. From its 19th century makeover, it reinforces the primacy of love and peace and charity and community. And thanks largely to Santa, it's an economic engine second to none. But let's please not forget about the baby at the heart of the story. People are suckers for babies, especially if they're born in mangers. As a matter of fact, my wife and I seriously considered having our first child in a manger so he'd be more popular. Babies poll well. They have a very high approval rate, very low negatives. They're equally popular with liberals and conservatives. Though I must say, conservatives especially love babies when they're being sexually trafficked by blood-sucking pedophiles. And to our listeners out there, if you didn't get that reference, go back and listen to our prior podcast about it.
Yes, yes.
Despite all those reasons I just gave, the primacy of Christmas still strikes me as weird because it's the Johnny-come-lately of winter holidays. It's largely a pastiche of pre-Christian festive traditions that we smushed together like meatloaf, slapped our Christian origin story on top, and then resold to the masses as the greatest story ever told, with your elegant term syncretism, which I now know to apply to that phenomenon. But really, it reminds me of that joke from This Is Spinal Tap, where the two band leaders are talking about the origins of the band. They initially called themselves the Originals, but they had to change their name when they learned that another band was called the Originals, so they renamed themselves
the new Originals.
Yeah. Christmas is basically the new Originals.
Yeah.
And to return to something I mentioned at the very top, that's why I have no patience for the so-called war on Christmas and its claim that politically correct liberals are actively censoring the use of the word to further their multicultural agenda of disrespecting Christianity and its sacred traditions. I've just shown how most of what we think of as the sacred traditions around Christmas were either borrowed, stolen, or otherwise co-opted from older, non-religious, even pagan traditions, or were just made up from whole cloth. I take the position that Christmas itself is a multicultural agenda.
Yeah.
The foremost purveyor of the war on Christmas myth, the self-appointed gatekeeper of all those sacred traditions, is Bill O'Reilly, who used to have a show on Fox before he was banished for practicing the sacred tradition of being a serial sexual predator. O'Reilly told his viewers in 2012 that liberals wanted, quote, a new America, and traditional Christmas isn't a part of it. If I may speak on behalf of all liberals for a second, if by a new America he meant an America without him in it, then guilty as charged. But his claim about traditional Christmas not being part of our new America is, to use a technical term, horseshit. If any Americans were responsible for a war on Christmas, it's the Pilgrims, who banned Christmas because it didn't line up with their rigid, stick-up-the-ass version of Christianity, which O'Reilly and his followers adhered to more closely than the actual Christian traditions of charity, fellowship, and loving your enemy that they claim to be defending.
Yeah.
It's O'Reilly and his ilk who don't understand anything about the multifarious roots of American Christmas tradition, which is sacred and profane, rowdy and sedate, real and imagined.
Right. And patched together from traditions that came from any number of immigrant groups, which, not coincidentally, are the same immigrant groups that Bill O'Reilly and people like him would prefer to remove from American culture and history entirely.
Right. Right. You said it. And these, seemingly antithetical traditions are like America. They're many contradictory things at once. And for me, at least, that's the real Christmas miracle. Have I enlightened you?
You did. You told me you reminded me of things I used to know and forgot, and you told me some things I didn't know, and I'm glad to know now. And as I was thinking through this, I was realizing that it's because Christmas is such a patchwork that it is so successful. Because if you've got a tradition that's rigidly defined within the liturgical calendar, and there's some ancient text that's telling you exactly how to practice it, and then 500 years pass, you're going to have fewer and fewer people who see that as relevant to their lives. But if you have something that's pieced together bit by bit of things that people liked somewhere else, then you're going to have a delicious stew, a delicious cultural stew that fits right into what people want to do.
Yes.
And what people want to do is to have something to celebrate at the time of year when the weather is the worst. What people want to do is to eat good food and watch movies and spend time with family and give gifts to kids and gifts to people they love. And Christmas just gives us the things that we like, and that's why it became so big. And so it is because that it's this cultural mess that it is what it is.
Yeah, I think that's beautifully put, Mark, and it makes me kind of feel warm and fuzzy because I would use your same words to describe the United States. The United States is itself a patchwork quilt, much like Christmas, and that's the strength of our nation. The know-nothings still don't realize that, but the rest of us understand that's the strength of the nation, and it's the strength of the Christmas holiday as well.
Yeah, it's like breeds of dog. Dogs that are very purebred are vulnerable to things like cancer and hip dysplasia,
Right.
But dogs that are total mutts are more healthy. Like the more elements that you have in a mix, the more resilience there is.
Yes.
And Christmas is a very resilient holiday, clearly, because it was picking up steam over 100 years ago, and it's even bigger today than it ever was. And it's probably just going to keep getting bigger because it has so many things going on that even people who hate Christmas find something about Christmas that they really like.
Christmas, America's favorite mutt. It's a great brand.
Yeah, I like it.
We can make $1 million on that if we weren't busy with a podcast, that is.
And busy shopping for Christmas presents.
Yeah. Okay, are you ready for your question for next time?
Lay it on me. I'm ready.
All right. So this is something in the news, quite recently in the news, in fact. This week brought what, to me at least, was a very surprising announcement from Major League Baseball that it was recognizing the Negro Leagues as major leagues, and that even more shockingly, all Negro League statistics would become part of Major League statistics. As with any significant change to the baseball world, which is profoundly conservative, small c conservative, MLB's announcement has provoked quite a bit of controversy. My question for you is, do you think this was a good idea? And is it even feasible to integrate the sketchy Negro League statistics into the much better record keeping of the major leagues?
I don't know yet, but I'll dive into this for a couple of weeks and I'll come back to you with an answer.
Okay, terrific.
So that's it for this week. I hope you learned something new about Christmas and maybe even something new that you'll integrate into your own personal Christmas tradition. If you have any thoughts on this episode or would like to leave comments on previous episodes, we have a Facebook page now. You can find it at Mansplaining Podcast. I hope you come by, like our page, leave a few comments, or even pose a question and we might answer it in a future episode. Hopefully we'll see you next time.
And as the Beatles once said, happy Crimble, everybody.
Happy Crimble. That's it for this edition of Mansplaining. Mansplaining is brought to you by Joe and Mark and nobody else. Thank you for hanging out with us for a little bit, and we'll see you next time.